right, great. We are live. Wonderful. So we'll give everyone a few minutes to come in here. Again, I am Gina from Advantage College Planning, and welcome back. If you have joined me for our Facebook Live events before, if you have not joined us, welcome. These are opportunities for you to learn a little bit about the college application process, college planning, little tips along the way to hopefully make the process a little bit easier for you and your students. So I'm really excited because today I am joined by Morris Cohnfars. He is the director of test prep at Arbor Bridge, which is an international test prep company. So Morris and I are going to be chatting today about test prep, tips for test prep, and then also the new SAT. So you may or may not have heard, if you have younger students, that the SAT is going to be changing format for students who will be like our starting sophomores. Our sophomores and younger are going to be impacted by this new SAT. So I wanted to have Morris come on and share a little bit about that. So welcome. Thanks so much for coming in as people are coming in and getting settled, hopefully with their lunch. So as you join and get settled in, go ahead and put in the chat what year you are, if you're a student, or if you have students, what year your students are, maybe where you're logging in from. Advantage College Planning is based over on the East Coast in the Raleigh Triangle, North Carolina area. Morris is over on the opposite coast. So he's tuning in today from California, right, Morris?
Yep, Los Angeles, California.
Yeah, fabulous. So we have coast to coast support here for you today. So lots of great information. So we'll go ahead and let's go ahead and get started. So, and as we're going through, also, feel free to add your questions in the comments as well. So Morris will be talking about a lot of different things related to test prep, but if you have any specific questions, go ahead and put those in the chat and we'll make sure to answer those as well. So to jump right in, again, I'm Gina from Advantage College Planning, and I am joined today by Morris Cohnfars. He is the Director of Tutoring at Arbor Bridge. So Arbor Bridge is an international test prep organization, and they were actually recently named the best online tutoring service in America by Business Insider. So very excited to have Morris here today to share his expertise about all things test prep. So thanks for being here, Morris.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah,
Happy
you
to
had to
help.
get up early to join me today from the West Coast. Awesome. So I'd love it if we could just start off talking about the SAT and the ACT, just kind of an overview of each test and maybe what the difference is between the two.
Sure. Yeah. So for now, the SAT and the ACT are pretty similar. Colleges seem to be accepting both, and I'm sure that's your area of expertise, but they don't seem to see a huge difference between examinations and which one is going to be accepted. The SAT has 4 sections. It has a reading test, an English test, or a writing test, and then 2 separate math components. It has a math no calculator and a math with calculator, and there's no essay. Whereas the ACT has 4 sections with an optional essay. The first section is going to be English. Next is going to be math, reading, and there's a science section, which is a huge difference between both exams. Now, the way we sort of look at these tests is usually the SAT, while the sections are pretty similar, the SAT has a lot more critical thinking involved. The questions tend to require a little more thought, a deeper analysis. So students tend to get a little bit more time per question on the SAT because the College Board knows that there's more critical thinking required for each question that they ask. And the SAT has a pretty neat way of trying to trick students into answering the wrong question. So you do get more time allotted per question, but you need that time. The ACT is more of a fast-paced exam. There's more questions on the ACT, so usually students need a little bit more stamina to kind of work through it, and they're given less time per question. So it's just a completely different test. So if you're typically a fast student that likes to work through easy questions at a really quick pace, the ACT might be for you. If you like critical thinking and you think that's a skill set that you have, the SAT might be for you. realistically, the questions are pretty similar in terms of the content being tested. It's just the way the questions are being asked and the types of questions that they're asking.
Got it. So I think you started to kind of get into my next question a little bit, which is how can students decide which test they should take? I get that a lot. Like, how do I know if colleges are going to see them equally, which from our
Mhm.
experience on the college consulting side, that's what we're seeing. How does a student know which one they should take?
So it's a tough question to answer. It's tough in that if you just walk in and you want to know exactly which test to take without coming in with any outside information, we'll get into what that means. It's hard to say which a student would be best at. Usually, what we like to do at Arbor Bridge is give students access to both tests. The student will take an SAT diagnostic and an ACT diagnostic, and we'll compare everything section by section to see which score would be easier to climb. So, we'll do a deeper analysis. We'll look at the English test. We'll look at the exact types of question that student's answering wrong, and are those questions easier to increase than the SAT? And we do a deeper analysis in that sense. The best way to determine which test to take is to take two practice tests, see which the student likes better, see which the student's performing better on, and that's the only real definitive way to determine which test would be best. And that is about a 6 to 7 hour process. So usually it's going to take 2 weekends. It's going to take about 2 weeks. But if you really want to figure out which test is best for you, best to take two practice tests and see where you're scoring and what test feels better to the student.
Right. I love that you mentioned too the idea of let's look at the sections that you took and then which sections are going to be easier to increase your
Yep.
score. I've heard students talk about that a lot when they're working with a test prep company. They'll say, well, my tutor said that it's going to be easier for me to increase in this section versus this section. Could you tell us just a little bit about that or just sort of the thought
Yeah.
that goes into that? I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. One of the big things for me when I'm looking at an SAT or an ACT is I like to really look critically at the English test because that test tends to be a little bit easier to climb. If a student is scoring lower in the English test, that's a pretty good sign for growth. So I usually use that as my first gauge, the first thing that I look at. Then I'll look at the English test, and I'll look at the specific questions that the student is answering wrong. On both English tests for the ACT and the SAT, there's two types of questions. There's grammar questions and rhetoric questions. Rhetoric questions are those that require a lot more editing skills. Grammar questions are just things like punctuation and do you know where to put a comma? If a student's scoring lower on grammar, that's a clear sign that there's great room for growth on the English test. So it's really looking at a deeper analysis of each section. We'll do that on each section of the exam to really see which one would be easiest to grow and ultimately which a student would spend less time on.
Got it. I love how you just lit up when you were answering that. Clearly, this is why Morris is the director of tutoring because this is his jam and he just got really excited about using data to
I
support
did.
students. I love that. Awesome.
Report.
Awesome. So we've started getting some questions and we've also started educating families a little bit about this, quote, new version of the SAT. So for families who haven't heard, students will starting sophomore year and younger, those students, when they sit to take the SAT, instead of taking that traditional pen and paper or pencil and paper test that we may be more familiar with, they're switching to a digital format. And there's some other changes as well that the SAT is making. So we're getting some questions. What do we need to know about this? How do we prepare for this? What can you share with families and me as well? You're always so full of information. I learned so much from you. What do we need to know about this new SAT?
Sure. I could pull up an image real quick
Yeah.
to
Okay, great.
really describe the differences between, the digital SAT and the current SAT. Let me pull that up. Give
Okay,
me a
perfect. Yeah. If
second.
you want to pull it up, I'll
And
put
we'll
that
run
in and
through all
I'll,
the differences. All right,
yeah,
here we go. Let me
I'll
share my
take
screen.
myself out. Right.
Okay, here we go. Cool. So you should see a screen right now talking about the differences between the paper-based and the digital SAT. So first off, in terms of what's changing, the biggest change is that it's now going to be a digital test. So students are going to be able to bring their own computers and use that in order to take the test. Their computer is going to be completely locked out. So as soon as you start the application that the College Board is going to have you download, you're not going to be able to have access to anything else on your computer. It's just going to be the College Board's SAT. And that's the first big change. So there are a lot of students that prefer paper-based tests. I know that I prefer paper-based tests, but once it moves to digital, that's not going to be a thing for the SAT anymore. It's going to be completely online. It's going to be completely on your computer, and there's no going back. It's all digital at that point. Another big change, and this is specifically for international students, is that there are going to be more international test dates. I don't think that's going to be a huge impact on domestic students, so we could ignore that for now. Students can still take the test at a school or a test center. That's not changing. But one big change that a lot of students love is access to a calculator. On the old paper-based test, there was a no calculator section and a calculator section, which sort of threw students for a little bit of a loop. Students obviously like having their calculator present, and now students are going to get the calculator on all parts of the test. Something cool that the College Board is actually doing too is they're actually going to be giving students access to a software called Desmos. And if you're a current student in high school, this is something that a lot of students have used. It's something that I used when I was tutoring back for Arbor Bridge. Students love that platform, and it's sort of like a safety blanket now. Now, if you forgot your calculator, you still have access to a calculator that most students are familiar with. So you'll be able to use Desmos right then and there, right in the middle of the math test, which I think is a pretty big perk. Another really big change that I think is going to be great for students, this is something I'm really excited about with the digital SAT, is the move from a 3-hour exam to a 2-hour one. The shorter time span is going to be really great for students, I think, especially with those students that have testing accommodations. When students have testing accommodations like 1.5 time or even double time, it really becomes difficult, dealing with a 5 or 6 hour test. The fact that it shortens they shorten the test to 2 hours, I think is going to have a big impact on all students, especially those that have to deal with testing accommodations, because stamina becomes a huge pain point for those students. Another really big test is that we're moving from a big change is that we're moving from 4 sections to 2. So we still have reading, writing, and math. Those sections haven't changed, but now it's just more concise. You only get 2 sections. And something that changed across the board that a lot of people are scared about is that the test is now becoming adaptive. What an adaptive test essentially means is that as you take the test is going to learn more about you as a student, and it's going to change. The questions that you're going to get are going to be different from the questions that the student right next to you is going to be taking. The way the College Board is essentially doing this is they're going to be breaking the sections up into modules. So what that essentially means is you take a cluster of questions, and if you do well on those questions, the next section is going to get a lot harder. If you do poorly on those questions, the next section gets easier. And it adapts based on your accuracy across the exam. So, what this essentially means is, let's say the test is going to be broken up into 3 modules. The first module, if you do really well on it, it's actually going to lock your score into a particular range. So, let's say you answer every single question right. Well, you still locked into a range where you can get that 1600. On the next cluster of questions, if you answer a few wrong, it locks you into a smaller range of students. And maybe it's going to tell you now that you could only get a 1400. It's not going to tell you directly while you're taking the test, but it's learning more about you and it's locking you in. It's only giving you questions that you can answer. The adaptive nature of the test means that a lot of students are going to get different exams. But what we've seen with the adaptive test is that a lot of students tend to feel better about it. We've had students who have been given access to the new SAT already. And a lot of these students are coming back to us saying that the test seems easier. They just feel a lot more comfortable with the test. Even if that might not be the case, because the students are going to be locked into lower tiers in terms of what they're going to be able to score, it's really helping students deal with this test mentally, and it's making them feel a lot more comfortable with the test. So a lot of students are going to be taking that first module, not answering every single question right, and the next module actually gets easier, which is why these students are getting that sense that the test is easier, when in reality, it's just locking them into a cluster of questions that they're able to answer, and it's locking in their score nice and early. So one huge benefit of the adaptive test is that it increases the comfort of these students, but it does get a little bit tricky in terms of grading. We'll hopefully get some more information on that once we see that first cluster of students taking their test. Another big change is the reading test, and this is particularly interesting, and it's going to really change how we at Arbor Bridge teach our students. The previous reading test is that students would get about 10 to 11 questions per passage. So a student would read through this pretty long passage and answer these 10 to 11 questions. And one big technique that we teach to our students is to answer questions as you go, so that you constantly learn more about the passage, so that you learn more as you're answering the questions. Well, strategies like those aren't going to work for the new SAT, because now you're going to get one passage and just one question. So there's no learning. It's just, hey, read this passage, answer this one question on that one passage, and that's all you get. There's no going back. There's no learning from your mistakes. It's just one passage, one question, which is a huge difference. The score is still going to be at a 1600. And one big perk is usually the SAT takes about 2 to 3 weeks to get your scores back. Now it's going to be 1 week. So you'll know exactly how you're scoring. So these are the big differences, with, I think, the adaptive nature of the test being the biggest component that's really going to change things for students. That and the one question per passage, which I think is going to be a hurdle for some students. It's one shot to get that question right. I think that's going to be a pretty big change. Now, something else we can talk about real quick is the let me open this up as well. The timelines for students.
Oh, yeah.
Actually,
Well, and
do
I
you have
had
any?
one.
Do you have any
Yeah,
about
we had a
this?
couple of questions come in. So just to clarify, this is not a test that an 11th grader who's planning to apply to college for 2024 entry would be taking.
No,
Okay.
not at all. 11th grader, you're going to be taking the paper-based tests. There's no chance that you'll get the digital SAT unless you somehow get an email from the College Board asking if you want to be a test subject.
Okay.
But those scores don't really count. Usually they're not counting those. It's just something that you could play around with. But yeah, you 11th graders don't need to worry about this.
And students will, like, once they go digital, it's not like, oh, I have a choice. I can do paper or I can do digital. It's just a hard switch.
A hard stop.
Okay.
So once the test goes digital, there's nothing you can do about it. You have to take the digital SAT. It's a done deal. So it's important that students make the choice of digital, paper-based SAT, or ACT before that transition occurs. And that's mostly for, I'd say, current 10th graders.
Right.
9th graders don't really have that option. They're probably going to be taking the digital SAT, but 10th graders do have that choice.
Like if they hustle,
Yeah,
they could hurry and get one in. So
yeah.
so then thinking about your earlier comments about planning ahead and kind of figuring out which test is better for you, when is the best time then for students to start preparing if they're going to do test prep for these exams?
So our favorite recommendation, and this is going to be for the digital SAT and the paper-based SAT and ACT, is to try and shoot for the 10th grade summer. So the summer right before 11th grade.
Okay.
Usually students tend to have a little bit more free time there. And that gives students the ability to really, now that we're going digital, decide what's best for them. They could come to us, take both SAT and ACT diagnostics, and we can kind of explore digital as an option with them as well. And that summer of their 10th grade year, going into their junior year, is probably the best option for most students to take the exam, especially considering that they're going digital. One big part of both tests that really does determine whether or not a student is ready to take these exams is whether or not the student has completed Algebra 2. So if you do want to consider taking the test in the summer of your 10th grade journey into junior year, make sure that you've finished Algebra 2 at the bare minimum. Algebra 2 is a big component of both exams, and it's a frequent requirement for both the ACT and the ACT. There is some pre-calc, but it's negligible. It's maybe 2 or 3 questions on the ACT, and I don't think I've ever seen an SAT question on pre-calc, despite sometimes recommending that students take pre-calc. I haven't seen it. But either way, Algebra 2 is probably the bare minimum a student needs. So if the student has completed Algebra 2 at the end of 10th grade, we recommend beginning prep in the summer. That way they can get it out of the way. And at that stage, they won't need to worry about the digital SAT at all, because it's going to be that subsequent March that they'd be taking that digital exam.
Okay. And so then, okay, so Algebra 2 in North Carolina public schools, we would call that NC Math 3. So for any local families, that would be that benchmark. And so then thinking about students who maybe don't have the choice to hop in early, like those freshmen who aren't going to have a choice to hop in early and get that paper-based test done, what do you advise? I mean, is it a good idea to be the first round coming through, the very first group to sit for this exam?
Oh, geez. So if you have to be the first group, be the first group. If there's nothing you can do about it and you need to be the first group, you need to take that test, take it. But we've been through these transitions plenty of times. And what we see is that the first 2 testing administrations are sort of a mess. It's not something we actively prefer students to do. So if you could skip the first 2 administrations, and this would be March 2024 would be the first administration, and then May would be the second. You want to try and avoid that if you can. It's just going to get messy. There's not going to be a ton of materials out there. We'll have materials, but after the first 2 administrations, our materials grow as well. We get a lot more information. The College Board gives a lot more information. We get a bigger sense of what the College Board is going to be doing. So that's our active recommendation. Realistically, we're probably going to be recommending that students lean more toward the ACT than the digital SAT. But things are always changing, and if that recommendation changes, we'll work with families to figure out what's best. The digital SAT is also being released at, I think, an inconvenient time. If you're planning on taking the digital SAT in March, May, or June, that's also AP testing season.
Right.
So you'd be needing to deal with a transition to a completely new test that you actively need to be studying for, and you're going to be studying for APs. So it's something that right now our recommendations are, hey, let's hold off the first 2 test administrations if you can. Let's maybe lean more toward the ACT, where we have some concrete information there on what you should be doing. But if the student needs to take the digital test, we're there for them and we can support them.
That's great. That's great advice. So then one other question I have is, you had mentioned earlier, and especially with the switch to the new digital SAT, how it'll benefit, students who have accommodations of extended time. I mean, that is such a marathon for those students. So just thinking in general, we get a lot of questions for students who maybe have accommodations in high school of extended time or testing in a separate setting and those kinds of things. any just general tips for families with students who receive accommodations that could potentially apply to test prep? What should they be thinking about?
Yeah. We get those questions all the time as well. Something that I can recommend right out the gate is if your student qualifies for accommodations, make sure they get those accommodations early and that they're actively using those accommodations through school. So make sure they have their 504 plan in place, their IEP in place, maybe in ninth grade, and that student is constantly using that accommodation so that it qualifies for the SAT and the ACT because it's such a huge hurdle for those students if that accommodation isn't in place. I was just talking with another family a bit ago where the student qualified for a 504 plan, but didn't really use the accommodation at school, mostly because she was embarrassed. She didn't want to feel like she was different. And that sort of operated as a hurdle for them to get the accommodation on the ACT and the SAT because she wasn't actively using it. So I think this is something that students sort of need to learn to get comfortable with. If they do get an accommodation, use it. It's not nothing to be embarrassed about. This is something that you're supposed to be using. Use it actively, and if they are using it, they'll be able to get the accommodation in on the ACT and the SAT as well. So biggest tip is get the accommodations early, get approved early, use those accommodations so that there's no hurdles when you need them on the ACT and the SAT, because it is a big help to those students that need those accommodations.
Yeah, that's such good advice. I used to work with a lot of students on IEPs and 504 plans back when I worked in the high school side. And I would face that a lot, just feeling embarrassed or whatever. But, I try to encourage students to think of it like someone who wears glasses, right? Or someone who needs to use a hearing aid. Like, you wouldn't say to that person, oh, well, just don't wear your glasses and you'll do just as well. You can see just as well. You probably don't need them. Obviously, that person's academic performance is going to be limited by how much they can see or how much they can hear. And so it's a similar concept. And I think sometimes that can help take a little bit of the stigma away for some
Yeah,
students.
yeah.
Yeah.
There is no stigma. No one should be, you know, embarrassed to use an accommodation that they
Right.
need. But it's a constant hurdle that I have to face with families as well. It's a constant hurdle that students need to face, and it's something that they really need to work through because
Yeah,
the accommodations are in place for a reason and they should be using.
exactly. Yeah. Great. Hear that, students? It's not just me saying that.
It.
Awesome. Heard it from the expert. Awesome. So we did have one question, Morris, thinking about test prep.
Mhm.
Is there an average increase in score that a student can expect if they do decide to work with a tutor?
Mhm. That varies. So something we do at Arbor Bridge is we can actually give you that recommendation once a student takes a diagnostic.
Okay.
So what we do is the student takes a diagnostic, and once we get that score report back, we compare it historically to how other students performed in our program,
Mhm.
and we can get a really clear picture of how much growth that student can get. The growth from a student scoring an 1100 to a 1200 or 1300 is going to be different than a student scoring a 1400 and getting to a 1450 or 1500. So it's hard to say what type of growth you'll expect without seeing that diagnostic and comparing it to the historical tendencies of students who have studied for the exam.
Got it.
It's a hard question to answer without getting like concrete data to work with. So if you want to get a sense of how much growth a student can reasonably expect, take a practice test and we can give you that answer.
Awesome. Great. Well, this has been super helpful. I always learn so much from our conversations. So I really appreciate you coming in and chatting with us. So thank you so much, Morris. For anyone who is interested in working with Morris and his team, you can find them at arborbridge.com. They are wonderful wealth of knowledge, and they work with students doing tutoring for, courses, as well as all different types of test prep, GRE, and everything, the whole gamut. Great. So if you found this helpful, then you should definitely come back because I will be here on October 23rd at 7 o'clock in the evening, and I'm going to do an Ask Me Anything. So students are right in the thick of their college application. So if you have seniors with questions, come on in. I'll answer those questions. And then if you have younger students as well, if you're thinking about test prep or anything else your student can be doing to prepare for the upcoming cycle, come on in on October 23rd at 7. And you also can find more information online. So if you go to see us at advantagecollegeplanning.com, you'll find more videos, our blog, our podcast, webinars, a wealth of resource. So thanks so much for joining me on your lunch break. It's always great to see all of you. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And we'll see you on the 23rd. Thanks, Morris. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Bye.